Imagine waking up one morning to find that your nation's economic future had been rewritten overnight. Not by your government, not by your people, but in a luxury hotel room thousands of miles away. That us, exactly what happened in 1985 when 5 of the world's most powerful nations gathered in New York, OES Plaza Hotel, and quietly reshaped the global economy. On that day, the United States convinced Japan, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom to agree to a plan that would artificially raise their currencies and weaken the dollar. But behind the diplomatic smiles and press releases lay something much darker, a calculated move that would cripple Japan's economy for decades and trigger one of the most dramatic economic booms and busts in modern history. Before we dive deeper into this secretive economic chess game, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know, from which country are you watching this video and at what time of day? I always love seeing how global our audience really is. Now let Yes uncover how one meeting at the Plaza Hotel set off a chain reaction that still shapes the world's financial system today. To understand why the Plaza Accord happened, we have to go back to the early 1980s, a time when the United States was in economic turmoil. After years of inflation, oil shocks, and stagnation, the U.S. economy finally began to recover under President Ronald Reagan. But that recovery came at a price. Interest rates were sky high, attracting foreign capital into the dollar. The greenback surged more than 50% in value between 1980 and 1985. On the surface, this looked like a sign of strength. The dollar was king again. But for American manufacturers, it was a death sentence. A strong dollar made U.S. exports far more expensive overseas, while imports from countries like Japan and Germany flooded into American markets. Japanese car makers, Toyota, Nissan, Honda, were crushing Detroit. Sony and Panasonic were taking over electronics. American factories were shutting down, and trade deficits ballooned to historic levels. By 1985, the United States owed more to the rest of the world than ever before, and public pressure was mounting. Something had to give. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japan was in the opposite situation. Its currency, the yen, was undervalued. Its exports were booming, trade surpluses were rising, and its foreign exchange reserves were swelling. But this success was built on a fragile foundation. Japan's economy had become dangerously dependent on selling goods abroad, especially to the United States. Washington was furious. In their eyes, Japan wasn't just competing, it was manipulating. U.S. officials accused Tokyo of keeping its currency artificially weak to gain an unfair trade advantage. And so they came up with a plan. The idea was simple and ruthless. It forced Japan to revalue its currency. If the yen became stronger, Japanese goods would become more expensive overseas, and America's exports would become more competitive. To make that happen, the U.S. needed the cooperation of its biggest economic allies. That's where the Plaza Hotel came in. On September 22, 1985, finance ministers and central bankers from the United States, Japan, West Germany, France, and the United Kingdom gathered in a private suite inside the Plaza Hotel in New York City. Behind closed doors, they signed what became known as the Plaza Accord, an agreement to coordinate action to drive down the value of the dollar. It was a rare show of economic unity, but also a quiet act of coercion. Japan, under immense diplomatic pressure, reluctantly agreed. In the following months, the yen skyrocketed. In less than 2 years, it rose from 240 yen per US dollar to under 120. For Japan, this was a seismic shock. Its export-driven industries suddenly faced collapsing profits. To cushion the blow, Japan's central bank, the Bank of Japan, slashed interest rates and pumped cheap credit into the economy. The government encouraged borrowing, investment, and speculation. And for a brief moment, it seemed to work. Japan entered one of the most astonishing asset bubbles in history. Land prices in Tokyo tripled. The stock market soared to heights no one thought possible. Ordinary people became overnight millionaires as the value of real estate and shares exploded. By 1989, the land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was said to be worth more than all the real estate in California combined. Japan looked unstoppable. But this was an illusion, one fueled by easy money, speculation, and false confidence. As the 1990s began, the bubble burst. Property prices collapsed, the stock market crashed, and Japan's banks were left holding mountains of bad debt. The government tried to rescue them, but the damage was too deep. Japan fell into a long economic winter, what economists now call the lost decades. Growth stagnated, wages froze, and deflation set in. A nation that had once been seen as the unstoppable rival to America became a cautionary tale. And here's the twist. Many economists believe it all started at the Plaza Hotel. What was supposed to be a temporary currency correction turned into a multi-decade crisis. By forcing Japan to strengthen the yen, the U.S. set off a chain of policy decisions that ultimately broke Japan's economic engine. The Plaza Accord didn't just rebalance exchange rates, it rewired the global financial system. But the story doesn't end there. The same mechanism that broke Japan would later come back to haunt the United States itself. Because when Japan's bubble burst, it exported its deflation to the world. Its investors, desperate for returns, flooded global markets with capital, driving down interest rates everywhere. That easy money eventually helped inflate bubbles in the West, from tech stocks to housing. In a sense, the Plaza Accord planted the seeds for the global boom and bust cycles we still see today. What makes this story even more fascinating is how it shows the hidden power dynamics of international finance. Nations don't just compete, they manipulate. And even allies, under the surface, are locked in a silent economic war. So how did Japan, once the rising economic superpower of Asia, become trapped in a cycle of stagnation? What lessons can we draw from the Plaza Accord today, especially as America now faces its own debt crises and currency challenges? Let's dive even deeper. In the years following the Plaza Accord, Japan's economy underwent a transformation unlike anything it had ever experienced. The currency revaluation created sudden pressure on exporters, which had long been the backbone of Japan's growth. Automakers, electronics companies, and industrial manufacturers were hit hardest. Their overseas profits shrank overnight. Factories began to slow production. Corporate leaders faced an impossible choice: accept lower earnings or find new ways to maintain growth. They chose the latter, and that choice would change Japan forever. To offset the damage, Japan's policymakers turned to aggressive monetary easing. The Bank of Japan cut interest rates repeatedly, pushing them to historic lows. Borrowing became cheap. Investors, businesses, and even ordinary households were encouraged to take loans. Easy money flowed everywhere. Real estate prices soared. The Nikkei stock index doubled and then tripled. Speculation spread like wildfire. People began believing that land and stock prices could never fall. Real estate became a national obsession. Banks offered huge loans against inflated property values. Corporations borrowed to buy assets, not to produce. The entire economy shifted from creating value to chasing paper gains. At its peak, Tokyo's property market was so inflated that the land value of the Ginza district was estimated at over $1 million per square meter. This was no longer growth driven by innovation or productivity. It was financialization, the transformation of Japan from an industrial powerhouse into a speculative bubble. And it was happening under the watch of policymakers who thought they were saving the economy from the shock of the Plaza Accord. As the decade wore on, the warning signs became impossible to ignore. Inflation began creeping higher. Asset prices grew disconnected from reality. Yet no one wanted to stop the party. Politicians were afraid of being blamed for a crash. Bankers were earning record profits. Ordinary citizens were buying multiple homes as investments. It was an illusion of wealth, one that felt real until it wasn't. By 1989, the Nikkei reached nearly 39,000 points, more than double what it had been just 3 years earlier. But under the surface, cracks were forming. Companies had borrowed heavily. Banks were overexposed to risky loans. And when the Bank of Japan finally raised interest rates to cool the market, the entire structure began to collapse. In 1990, the Nikkei started falling. At first, people thought it was a temporary correction. Then the decline accelerated. Within 2 years, Japan's stock market had lost more than half its value. Property prices soon followed. The real estate bubble imploded, wiping out trillions in paper wealth. Families who had bought homes at peak prices were left underwater. Businesses that had borrowed against inflated assets faced bankruptcy. Banks were saddled with bad loans they could never recover. This was the beginning of Japan's lost decades, a period of stagnation that would drag on for more than 30 years. The once unstoppable economic giant now faced deflation, sluggish growth, and a demographic time bomb. Japan's government launched stimulus after stimulus, spent trillions on public works, and tried to prop up demand, but nothing seemed to work. The psychological damage was as deep as the financial one. A whole generation lost faith in growth. Young people stopped investing in stocks or property. Companies hoarded cash instead of expanding. Deflation turned saving into a trap, making debt harder to pay off. What began as a policy decision at the Plaza Hotel ended as a societal transformation. From optimism to caution, from ambition to hesitation. Meanwhile, in the United States, the outcome was the exact opposite. The weaker dollar helped American exports recover. The manufacturing base stabilized temporarily. But perhaps the most important effect was political. The U.S. had demonstrated its power to shape global finance at will. The Plaza Accord proved that America could realign the world economy through coordinated diplomacy, even when it meant sacrificing its allies' stability. Yet the success was short-lived. While the U.S. enjoyed a temporary trade balance improvement, it failed to address the underlying causes of its deficits: structural overspending and financialization. Over the next decades, America repeated the same mistakes Japan had made. Cheap credit, speculation, and asset bubbles became the new norm. The very policies that broke Japan became the foundation of the modern American economy. But let's return to Japan, because the deeper tragedy lies not in the bubble, but in the aftermath. The government and the central bank, desperate to save the system, refused to let markets clear. They bailed out banks, rolled over bad loans, and propped up zombie corporations. Instead of letting unproductive companies fail, they kept them alive with cheap credit. This created a cycle of dependency. Productivity stalled, innovation slowed. Japan's economy entered a liquidity trap. Interest rates near zero, yet no one wanted to borrow. Consumers were too cautious, corporations were too conservative, and banks were too risk-averse. Every attempt to stimulate demand ended in disappointment. Deflation became entrenched. Prices stagnated or fell. Wages barely moved. To fight back, Japan launched massive government spending programs. Bridges, tunnels, and highways were built everywhere, even where they weren't needed. The hope was that fiscal stimulus would jumpstart growth. But each round of spending produced only short-term gains, followed by another slump. Debt ballooned. By the early 2000s, Japan's public debt exceeded 200% of GDP, the highest among developed nations. Still, growth never returned to its former strength. Japan's population began aging rapidly, further shrinking demand. A once vibrant society grew cautious and inward-looking. What had started as a currency revaluation turned into a long, slow erosion of dynamism. The story of Japan, after the Plaza Accord, is more than a lesson in economics. It's a warning about unintended consequences. Policy decisions made in the name of stability can sow the seeds of disaster when they distort incentives and reward speculation over productivity. For the United States, the Plaza Accord was a short-term fix to a political problem, the outcry over trade deficits and factory closures. But for Japan, it was a turning point from which it never fully recovered. It showed how global coordination can sometimes become coercion, how economic diplomacy can mask power politics, and how small shifts in monetary policy can reshape entire nations. And yet, Japan's experience didn't stop other countries from repeating its mistakes. In the decades that followed, China, South Korea, and even the United States would experience their own versions of asset bubbles driven by cheap money and policy manipulation. Each believed it could control the outcome. Each learned that markets have limits to how long they can defy reality. The Plaza Accord may have been signed nearly 40 years ago, but its shadow still looms over global finance. It taught nations how to use currency as a weapon, how to inflate, and deflate economies through coordination, and how even allies can inflict lasting harm on one another in the pursuit of economic advantage. But perhaps the most revealing part of the story lies in what came next, how Japan tried to fix the damage, and how those choices continue to define its future today. As Japan entered the 21st century, its economy was still haunted by the ghosts of the Plaza Accord. The decisions made in the 1980s had permanently altered its trajectory. While the rest of the world celebrated the rise of Silicon Valley, the dot-com boom, and later the explosion of emerging markets, Japan remained stuck in a deflationary loop. Its central bank, once viewed as a model of discipline, became trapped in perpetual crisis management. Every policy was reactive. Every recovery was fragile. By this point, the Bank of Japan had experimented with nearly every tool available. Interest rates were cut to zero. Quantitative easing, the large-scale purchase of government bonds, became standard practice years before the United States adopted it after 2008. Yet despite these interventions, inflation never returned. Growth never normalized. The deflationary mindset was too deeply entrenched. This wasn't just a technical failure, it was a cultural shift. People stopped expecting prosperity. Home prices never recovered. Stock values stayed depressed for decades. Retirees hoarded savings instead of spending. Young people avoided risk, preferring stability to ambition. The idea of lifelong employment became less about loyalty and more about survival. The dynamism that had fueled Japan's post-war miracle had quietly faded. Meanwhile, outside Japan, economists and policymakers were studying its fate. They called it Japanification, a scenario where low growth, low inflation, and low interest rates become permanent. At first, they viewed it as a uniquely Japanese problem. But by the 2010s, other advanced economies began showing similar symptoms. Europe and the United States adopted zero interest rates. Central banks printed money in unprecedented quantities. Asset prices soared while real wages stagnated. The same disease had spread. It became clear that Japan's story was not an anomaly. It was a preview. The Plaza Accord had been the opening act in a new era of monetary manipulation, one where economic outcomes were increasingly engineered by policymakers rather than earned through productivity. And when governments lose faith in organic growth, they turn to credit, debt, and financialization to keep the illusion alive. For Japan, the cost was immense. Its public debt ballooned to levels once thought impossible. Yet, unlike other nations, Japan could sustain it because most of its debt was held domestically. This allowed the illusion of stability to persist, but the consequence was stagnation. An entire generation born after the 1990s grew up never knowing what a booming economy felt like. The lost decades had turned into a lost generation. What made Japan's case even more remarkable was how its downfall had been engineered not by military defeat or internal corruption, but by an international agreement designed to help. The Plaza Accord was supposed to correct imbalances, not destroy one of the world's strongest economies. But the combination of forced currency appreciation and easy credit set off a chain reaction that no one could stop. If you look closely, you'll see similar dynamics repeating today. The global economy is once again built on cheap debt and artificial stability. Central banks, from the Federal Reserve to the European Central Bank, use interest rates as levers to control the world's largest financial system. Every major economy now fears deflation and recession more than inflation, leading to policies that reward debt and punish saving. It's the same trap Japan fell into, only this time it's global. When nations manipulate their currencies or interest rates, they often believe they are protecting themselves. But in a tightly interconnected system, one country's relief becomes another's burden. The Plaza Accord showed that even well-intentioned cooperation can become coercion. Japan's leaders didn't resist the U.S. demands in 1985 because they believed in partnership. Yet, the outcome revealed a brutal truth. Global financial diplomacy rarely serves all parties equally. The irony is that Japan's economy still remains one of the largest in the world. Its infrastructure, technology, and social stability remain unmatched in many respects. But the spark of growth, the belief in an ever-rising future, never returned. What America saw as a necessary rebalancing turned out to be Japan's slow-motion decline. For investors and policymakers today, the lesson is clear. Artificial adjustments to markets carry hidden costs. When exchange rates, interest rates, or capital flows are forced out of balance, the long-term damage can outweigh the short-term gains. Every currency intervention leaves a scar. Every manipulated boom carries the seeds of its own collapse. The Plaza Accord is often remembered as a technical agreement, a diplomatic success. But in reality, it was the beginning of a shift toward financial domination, where politics and policy replaced productivity as the drivers of economic outcomes. It revealed how much power a single nation could wield over another without firing a shot. And while the U.S. may have won that round, the world it created in the process is now turning against it. The same debt-driven system, the same reliance on low rates and endless liquidity, has made every major economy vulnerable. The United States, like Japan before it, has built prosperity on leverage and confidence. And as history shows, both can disappear overnight. Japan's story serves as a mirror. It reflects what happens when a nation trades long-term vitality for short-term relief. It shows how even the most advanced economies can lose their edge when growth is replaced by speculation. Most importantly, it proves that no amount of central planning can outsmart human behavior. When people stop believing in the future, no policy can force them to spend, invest, or innovate. The Plaza Accord wasn't a conspiracy. It was a cautionary tale. It teaches us that global economic cooperation often masks imbalances of power, and that the cost of policy manipulation can last generations. Japan learned this lesson the hard way. The question now is, has the rest of the world learned it yet? Because every nation today faces the same temptation: to print, to borrow, to manipulate, to delay the reckoning. But, as Japan proved, every delay only makes the fall harder when reality finally returns. The next time you hear a policymaker talk about managing currencies or stimulating growth through easy money, remember the Plaza Accord. Remember Japan's rise, its fall, and its long, quiet struggle to recover.